And thank you for joining our thought leadership series, IronNet Engaged. I'm Michael Donahue, IronNet's Chief Marketing Officer. We appreciate your joining us to engage in this really critical topic, defined as how to defend against nation state adversaries at the convergence of IT networks and OT networks and industrial control systems. So I'm pleased to have here with me today two leaders who are seriously committed to the mission of protecting critical infrastructure. You could say that neither of our pioneering speakers need an introduction, but let's take a moment to acknowledge and honor their accomplishments. So first is Robert M. Lee. Robert is recognized a pioneer in the industrial security incident response and threat intelligence community. He gained his start in security as a U.S. Air Force cyber warfare operations officer tasked to the National Security Agency, where he built a first of its kind mission identifying and analyzing national threats to industrial infrastructure. He went on to build the industrial community's first dedicated monitoring and incident response class at the SANS Institute and an industry recognized cyber threat intelligence course as well. So Robert, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Next, I would like to introduce IronNet's own retired General Keith Alexander. General Alexander is the founder, chairman, co-CEO, and president. General Alexander is reinventing how industries approach cybersecurity. General Alexander is a four-star general with an impressive 40-year military career, culminating in the role of the director of the National Security Agency and chief of the Central Security Services, CSS, from 2005 up through 2014. And while serving as the NSA director, General Alexander was appointed by Congress to be the first commander to lead the U.S. Cyber Command. He held this role from 2010 to 2014, establishing and defining how our nation is protected against cyber attacks. So Robert and General Alexander, it is an honor to have both of you here. Thank you both. Before we get started with the fireside chat, just want to start with a little housekeeping. I did have a conversation with Robert and General Alexander before the talk, and they said they would prefer to answer questions in real time as we go. So please ask questions throughout. Don't wait towards the end. Ask them in the Q&A sidebar, and we'll either get to them live or also get to them in the bar itself. So let's jump into why we're here. I'm going to first kick it over to General Alexander, who's going to talk about, kind of an historical view of where we've been and what he's seen over the past 10 years. And then Robert's also going to talk about today, but he's going to first focus on the Ukraine and what happened in 2015, and then tell us that kind of journey up through today. But first, General Alexander, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the last couple of years, which you've seen as well.
Well, thanks. And Rob, it's an honor and privilege to be here with you once again. We greatly appreciate the partnership. I firmly believe that the IT/OT industrial control system approach and collective defense neighborhood watch approach is critical to defending critical infrastructure and others in our country and in our allies. We live in what the Chinese would say, interesting times. When you think about what's going on today with China, with Iran, and with Russia, never has cyber been as relevant as it is today. We see a pact between Russia and China emerging, where they have now agreed on military operations specifically aimed at the United States. How do you counter the U.S. for what they see is our obstruction to their goals? For China, it's Taiwan. For Russia, it's Eastern Ukraine. And in between those two is Iran. And Iran has been working diligently, attacking the Gulf states and others in cyber and in physical attacks, and have leveraged the Houthis to conduct attacks over the last few weeks. As you may recall, Iran led the attacks in 2012 against the energy sector, specifically Saudi Aramco, and hitting some of our energy companies, and the financial sector with distributed denial of service attacks. we were concerned in 2014 that those attacks would become actually physical destructive attacks against the financial sector. And we've seen that play out. Rob was a key person, and we'll come back to this, in the 2015 attack on Ukraine, analyzing that and looking at what happened, and did so again in the 2016 timeframe. So we're going to come back to that in a minute and talk about that. Well, Rob is going to talk about that. We'll let the experts deal with the expert part of this. I'm going to talk about, so where are we with Russia? Where are we with Russia today and what's going on? In 2014, Russia did something very similar to what they're doing today against the Crimea. It started in the February time period and went through March. That attack, false flag operations, these aren't our people. Putin said that multiple times. Those little green men aren't ours, aren't ours, aren't ours. Take over Crimea, and lo and behold, oh, those were our guys. Oh, we're surprised. You're surprised, you bought it. And that type of deception planning by Russia, Maskirovka, is the way they deal. Now look at what's going on today. 100,000 troops on the border of Eastern Ukraine. That's a significant number of personnel, military personnel, in the wintertime on the border of Eastern Ukraine. They're there as a show of force and to give Putin options to go after Eastern Ukraine. And when you think about it, this is probably, from his calculus, the best opportunity to do so. He believes the United States is weakened from what he's seen in Afghanistan and elsewhere, with all our internal debates and problems, both political and with COVID. He sees a Europe that is semi-involved and now getting more involved and pushing back. And he's, I think, debating with his team and perhaps with himself, do we go or don't we go? If he's going to go, this is probably his best opportunity. He feels he has the least to lose in doing that. In fact, as an example, if you look at the Nord Stream 2, which is where he would make a lot of money with Europe, he believes that's a way of leveraging these actions and keeping Europe out of this type of contest. And I believe that will and could happen. So we need to be aware of that. And more importantly, if that attack occurs in the past, look at 2007 against Estonia, 2008 against Georgia, look at all the things up through the NotPetya in 2017 and the energy sector attacks 2015 and 2016, all included cyber. And now we look at what they've done with SolarWinds and with the Colonial Pipeline. You could say those are rehearsals for what they could do. And this is where we as a country need to step back and say, what do we do to defend? And it's our joint belief that collective defense, working together, is the way to address this. And so as I see it, if we don't work together, we'll be defeated individually. And by working together, I mean beyond just sharing what we know, to true network speed sharing of events to help defend our critical infrastructure and to get the public and private sector to work together. That's what we need to do as a nation. And that's what Ukraine needs to do, as an aside. So I thought we'll take a minute, and I'm going to pass this over to Rob. And we are teamed with them in this regard. But Rob actually was a key person in the 2015 assessment of what happened in the Ukraine in 2016. So without further ado, Rob, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, sir. And definitely an honor to be on here with you as well. It's pretty awesome to have been in the NSA when you were there. Looked up to you as a person and be able to jump on a webinar and talk about these things. So thank you for your time as well. To everybody out there, yeah, the parallels in Ukraine are important. And I think if you've listened to anything I've stated before, or honestly, just a good portion of our infrastructure community, we've talked about the lessons learned in Ukraine in 2015 and 2016 numerous times. But I want to give you a quick recap, just a level set for everybody, so that I can build parallels for what we're going to talk about today. So when we look at what happened in Ukraine, I think there was a lot of confusion around exactly what took place. And it was kind of an interesting test where, depending on your background and preferences and expertise, everybody looked at the same event and took away something a little bit different. I remember a lot of the vendors coming out at the time talking about Black Energy 3 malware and how, hey, this malware was in their networks. And it was. And that was a very important part of the conversation, especially on the IT side of the house. My comments, though, will reflect why it's so important to understand the IT and the OT side of the house. You got to do both, but to treat them uniquely. So when we looked at the 2015 attacks, the adversary gained access to 3 different Ergos, so 3 different utilities at the distribution level across a matter of months. Realistically, in the IT networks, they compromised them and then moved into the OT networks within a week. And then for about 6 months, stayed inside the operations environments to learn and gather insights before they actually launched their attack. So if you think about the parallel of our own infrastructure, luckily our utilities in the US, as well as many other infrastructure providers, have done a lot to try to increase their defenses. And they really are good stewards of the community in doing that, while we're always trying to do more to keep up, right? But the interesting thing, of course, is what happened between those networks, between the IT and the OT networks, where the adversary actually moved from the IT networks by understanding the accounts and credentials and connections into the operations networks, using those native credentials and communications, getting into the operations networks, and then they didn't use malware to achieve their attack. It actually wasn't a lot of what gets talked about in InfoSec relates to malware vulnerabilities, exploits, those things. That wasn't the focus. And the focus on the operations side was leveraging the native functionality that's built into the system. If an electric system operator can open up a circuit breaker and close a circuit breaker, so could the adversary after they learn how to do that. So in the IT side of the house, a lot of the fundamentals we talk about and a lot of the things that you would want to know, that makes sense. But not being able to see as things move from IT to OT or up from OT to IT, that was really a big gap for them. And of course, once it got into the operations networks, it wasn't around antivirus or patching or so forth. It was about understanding behaviors in those environments. And that's a place that was really exciting when IronNet wanted to partner with Dragos anyways, is just from John Alexander's background and his team's background and my team's background. A lot of us kind of came from the same places where we understood that just tracking technical indicators or just trying to track malware samples is not going to be a scalable answer. You've got to move to understanding tactics, techniques, and procedures. You got to move to understand the behaviors of these adversaries. And that really formed the basis of how we think about the problem. But then to General Alexander's point, getting to a point where we understand what's happening across the community in real time. And this is where I think it really didn't do a lot of people the service in what came out of Ukraine 2015, where there was a lot of confusion and rumor mills and people passing back and forth notes and non-real-time analysis. And there was a lot of bad takeaways. I remember for the Ukrainian utilities, as an example, when we talked to the other utilities in the country, they didn't even know the attack had happened. And we were kind of stunned on the various people going over there and interacting with these folks. Was pretty stunned on, what are you talking about? Like, we're having tabletop exercises in American utilities. What do you mean you don't even know it happened? It's your country. There are your partner utilities. But the information was just so slow to get out that most people didn't even know what had happened. They just thought there was some disruption on the power system. And then when it came to the US side of the house, as the information populated around, as I mentioned earlier, the story all became about Black Energy. Then the story all became about kill disk malware, disrupting certain systems. It was a hodgepodge of details where if we would have all been drinking from the same trough, to steal Chris Inglis's quote, that if we were all drinking from the same trough of information at the same time, we could have all then been able to come up with the analysis necessary to really defend ourselves in real time. And probably the other interesting thing about Ukraine, as we then start pivoting towards what's happening now, is essentially what was going on there had a lot of parallels to what we'd seen in the US before. And I think this is the piece where most folks miss. The actor behind the attack, we call them Sandworm, have been acknowledged by the US government and others to have been the Russian government. When the Russian government compromised those utilities, they had actually already compromised US electric utilities a year and a half before. So what got everybody spun out of shape, what got everybody really focusing on this, especially in the US, is that same team had compromised electric utilities in the US in 2013, 2014. So to see that same team then cross the divide, cross that red line, if you will, and take down electric infrastructure was very concerning. And there was a big question in the national policy scene on, are we still compromised? Like, is that adversary that compromised utilities in 2014, are they out, or have we rooted them out? Do we even know? And that lack of insight and visibility into what's the current state of this adversary in our infrastructure, that causes a lot of angst, as you would expect. And so when we talk about these concepts of like collective defense as an example, to me, one of the big values, besides having everybody drink from the same trough and understand the same threat picture, a real value is being able to ask smart questions of our data in real time. So if U.S. government, if National Security Agency as an example, if we look at other regions of the world, maybe the NCA in Saudi Arabia, the ACSC in Australia, NCSC in UK, call it however you want, but for trusted partners in the community to be able to ask thoughtful questions. Hey, have any of you seen SolarWinds? Have any of you seen SolarWinds in this version? Have anybody seen SolarWinds in this version and the exfiltration activity? Being able to ask those thoughtful questions in real time across everybody can dial down the hype when there's no reason to spin up, or can focus us like a lightning rod when there is a reason to focus. And as I summarize up and kick back to Michael or John Alexander, I would say that where I think everybody's concerned now is we are all chiefly aware that if history is any teacher, we will see attacks on U.S. infrastructure if conflict kicks into the Russian and Ukrainian border. Now, I don't want to come and deliver hype and say, oh, it's going to happen and be predictive and spin everybody out of control. But that's actually the government's latest assessment as well. For those of you in the community, you may have been privy to an alert that went out, I believe, 2 days ago from the national security community here in the U.S. It was an unclassified document, so we can talk about it. But it stated, if conflict does kick off, we do fully expect cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure. And I think what caused a lot of confusion for folks is there's not a lot of actionable details in that. There's no understanding of the TTPs. There's no understanding of the technical indicators. There's no understanding of vulnerabilities. Like, there's no technical details in that. So I think there was a, hey, why does this matter kind of reaction from a lot of the people we talked to. But I will tell you, for the government to stand behind that intelligence at this point in time and talk pretty overtly about the fact that, yes, we do fully expect these attacks. As we've talked to our government partners, it is because they do have real intelligence to support that. And so it is not incumbent on the community to ask about technical indicators and so forth. It's incumbent on the community to go get proactive, go hunting, go get into your environments and try to make sure that you're doing okay, because these are definitely tense and, as the general said, interesting times. But Michael or
that incredible 20 minutes of insight from both gentlemen, and I really appreciate the engagement as well from our audience. Just quickly on logistics, and it would be great if you guys, and I see this is happening now, put your questions in the Q&A versus in the chat. That way we'll definitely be able to answer them. So some great questions here as well, tying IT to OT, and I want to come back to that. But since we're talking about Ukraine and Russia, let's tap into those questions here as well before we move into that section. So, Andrew has a great question about clarity and information. I think it's a great one for you, General Alexander. Clarity and information sharing on attacks and activity is important. That said, Russia excels in disinformation. So do you foresee disinformation efforts by foreign actors in cybersecurity information sharing once they start in, how important is that and how do we address that?
Yeah, so it is key. What Russia does with disinformation is key to their approach. They use that, and I can give you a great example that they used in the Ukraine several years ago to try to get a divide between the ethnic Russian people and the ethnic Ukrainian. And they came up with a story that ethnic Ukrainians had bayoneted a 3-year-old boy and put his body in the yard of his parents. And they gave an address and said, here's where it is. And they pushed that throughout the media. And of course, the Russian population went hysterical on this. They thought, how could this happen? And in fact, when you went to that address, it wasn't a Russian family that lived there. It was a Ukrainian family. And there was no a 3-year-old boy or anything done like what they claimed. But they make that hype, and that gets two cultures fighting against each other. There was a parallel question, if I might just take this on, Michael, and maybe Rob and I can take this, because the question is follows on from Rob's discussion with why will they attack the United States? And there's a couple of reasons to attack us. And that is in response to the sanctions that we will put on them. And more importantly, to disincentivize us from providing increased support to the Ukraine if they do try to take it over. And what that really goes to, if you look at the art of war is not what our government believes. It's what we, the American people, and what our allies, what the people believe. Do they support what our government is doing? And so an attack on the oil and gas sector or any critical infrastructure, if you take that down, the hardships our people endure will now be weighed on the administration's mind of how much more do we take before we just let this go. It's not worth the problem. That's the issue that we face. I am reminded, I'm not this old, so Rob, don't say it, I'm not this old, but if you look at Pearl Harbor, that was such a case. However, the adversary misunderstood our will. And I suspect it will be the same here. If an attack goes on our country and we know it's the government of Russia, I think it will backfire. I really believe that. I think the American people say, that's how you're going to play the game, because we're not out of the woods. We have the most to lose. We've got to go get out in front of this. But I believe they've done that in places like Georgia. They use cyber as an element of their power. They use it in Estonia, and they're going to use it in Ukraine. And if you think about all the things that we talked about, the real problem that we see is not just the attack, but also collateral damage, not petcha, collateral damage, $10 billion plus of damage. So I think those are the things that I'd look at. Rob, any thoughts on your side?
I completely agree. And I think, one of the things that concerns me most is exactly what you're talking about. And it's not that the grid goes down or all the pipelines go down, right? There's not one electric grid. There's not just one pipeline that's critical to everybody. Like there's key points, don't get me wrong. And we have a lot more work to do, but our infrastructure providers do take all this seriously. The thing that concerns me is the ability of an adversary to do some disruption. So it may not take down all the United States, but let's say they take down a couple distribution sites across the Southeast or a couple distribution sites across the DC area. The hype that then follows that, the disinformation that they can then go and amplify, we've planted Russian malware in every site in America, like whether or not it's true, once there's a demonstration of capability, it is going to be very difficult for people to prove a negative. And I think that there is going to be an immense amount of hype and concern and normal folks, not cybersecurity practitioners, that are just terrified. And especially in the middle of a pandemic where everyone is still on edge, still facing hardships, to throw in disinformation with localized and focused attacks that cause fear. I think that has I think it's a recipe for disaster. Now, I do like to believe in the betterment of the American public and our community, and would hope that we would rally correctly. But I think we're asking a lot, and the more we can do to decrease the consequence of those effects, and get the early warnings and signals out to the people, not only to protect our infrastructure, but to be able to shape our narrative back. I think it's incumbent upon us as professionals to do that.
A great point. And there's a great question here as well, to kind of bring it back to our partnership also. So Arvind Mistry very simply puts, we are taking, and we being globally, a defensive position here. So what can we do to go on the offensive, right? And so this partnership between Dragos and IronNet, and you both referenced the collective defense, how do we position that as an offensive move to be able to harden and protect, our infrastructure?
Yeah, I'll take a quick first pass to say, like, just to clarify, I don't think we would be referring to anything that we're doing or talking about as offensive in nature.
Yes.
But I get the intent of the question is, how can we be more proactive? And I would remind people that as we look at the state of our cybersecurity, while on one hand, I'm extraordinarily very happy for the light and water and power and everything that I use, and always praise the infrastructure communities, we have a long road to go. in terms of doing the security efforts that we know we need to do. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Nobody's being malicious. But oftentimes I hear people want to go to offense because they'll make statements like, well, defense is losing. We keep not winning in defense. We should try something else like offense. And though that wasn't the intent of the question, I'm sure I just want to make sure to address that most of the time, the reason people lose is not because the state of defense is losing. It's because they haven't been doing defense. And so when you don't do security and it doesn't work, you start eluding, well, what can we do else? And I would say, actually, if we look at the kind of efforts that we've done, the kind of efforts we're talking about, the collective defense approach that IronNet and Dragos has taken, like those are all options that on the market. There's a number of people out there that do all sorts of good security work. And by going and putting in the work, you'll find that defense is doable. But John Alexander, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, this is, and Chris Inglis has talked about collective defense and the Solarian Commission. I'm going to put it in my words. Right now, every company essentially defends itself, and the events that are going on against that company right now aren't visible to anyone, including the company, especially if they go outside the current detection capabilities. As a consequence, no one knows the threat to that company until something bad happens. By that time, it's too late. You're talking incident response. So what the partnership between Dragos and IronNet is, how do we create that view, that understanding of the events that are going on? I'm going to liken this, Rob's former Air Force, so he's going to say, use an Air Force analogy. So let's think about a radar picture for cyber. How do you see what's going on in cyber from a radar perspective? Share that information in real time amongst members within a community so they can work together to defend that sector, and share that anonymized view with the government so the government can do its job to defend the government, and they are the ones that can do offensive operations to go after the bad guys. If you think about the way we set up our missile defense, it was just like that. We don't share information on incoming missiles via email after someone has detected a missile flying overhead. That would be way too late. We do that near real-time radar picture. That's what we're talking about in cyber. How do we take this to real time and share that information together? And what Rob and I understood is that the IT and OT have to work together. We see things going across the IT sector, he needs to know it in the OT. He sees things going across the OT sector, we need to see it in the IT. And the customer needs to see that joint picture and understand it, because that's what defense on his company means. And then if he can see that amongst others in his sector in an anonymized way, they can start to understand and react much quicker. The government can see it. And we're now achieving what they put in the Solarium report and others, the collective defense. And that's where I think we have really generated some interest amongst the oil and gas and the energy sector for doing just that, to protect the critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I would just double down on that, if you don't mind, Michael, to say that when we look at the capability, and not to position this too much, but I see the chat lighting up, which is good, where, talking about the radar picture analogy, to me, what's so amazing about all this is we all try to be prescriptive sometimes on what we think the answer should look like, but we're not exactly good about talking about the requirement. And we saw this in Congress, and not putting down any of the congressional actions, but there was requirements around like incident response reporting. Hey, if a utility gets hit with a cyber attack, we want to know about it. And the actual bill was pretty broad, and it didn't pass. And I'm sure we'll see something like that in the future. But there was a lot of debating about the nuance and the details when the point was getting missed. The main point wasn't, we want your data. It wasn't, we want to know who you are. It was, the United States government has a need to know the common threat picture that's operating inside the United States, and to be able to have their duty to inform their members, their constituents, and keep their community safe. And so when General Alexander and I talk about collective defense as an example, it's not about a bunch of data sharing or yet another information sharing program. It's exactly that of, let's all look at the exact same picture at exactly the same time. Not Dragos has a bunch of unique insights and we publish a threat report every now and then, or IronNet has that, or a utility knows what's going on in their environment, or the government has their sources and methods. None of that. Literally all of us in real time see exactly the same information, can go use that to drive what we want to do, but no data is being shared. It's just insights. And it's completely anonymous to what John Alexander mentioned, where I think a lot of participants rightfully have concerns about giving away their identity. Because even though we're happy to share as a community, you don't want somebody else to know about your incident before you do. And so having that anonymization capability where you can still share the insights, but you get to handle your own incidents and be in the driver's seat for that. I think that's so core. And what works really well in this community, it's not exclusive to electric, it's not exclusive to oil and gas. Like it can work in any community, but what really drives it forward in the electric and oil and gas community is there is a true community there. The CEOs know each other, the CSOs know each other, they work together. We all try not to compete on security. We just want to make our community safer. You'll constantly hear the electric utilities say, hey, we live and work in the communities we serve. So that idea of that herd-like community coming together, and if one of us gets punched in the face, all of us see it and can respond in real time. I think it resonates really well with this community.
Yeah, I think you answered a question I was going to bring up as well in terms of, a practical use case here. Joseph Chesney brings up a question around, how does this all apply to the small co-ops and munis, right? Don't have an organic IT cybersecurity team in place. And you think about your great example there. You think about the partnership that we have with NIPA. There's a great use case here as well. So maybe take it down to a practical level too, where it's not for the big, large enterprises, that supply chain security is critical, and the smallest weak link in your supply chain could create, this danger for everybody.
Yeah, I would briefly state that there's a couple different ways to handle that. One is the example you just gave, like NIPA as an example. So I know you all working closely with them, we're working closely with them, and their intent is not only let's protect NIPA, it's how do we take care of the smaller co-ops in our state. And that is just such a wonderful sentiment. That's exactly what I'm talking about with the community. You'll see that same thing with Salt River Project. You'll see the same thing with Southern Company, with Berkshire Hathaway Energy, with Southern California Edison. Like, pick a name in our electric community of somebody, and I guarantee you they're going to bend over backwards to try to help the co-ops and utilities around them as well. They're just all good players. So that's one way to handle it. Another way, honestly, is I think there's an economic imbalance where a lot of the large investor-owned utilities or investor-owned pipeline companies or so forth have the ability to have the resources to go do the security they need to do. And there's mechanisms in the federal government for them to capitalize certain projects to be able to get rate returns, to go do things that benefit the community. That's wonderful. But if you talk about small co-ops, electric, water, gas, they don't have that capability. And where I live, I live in Maryland, but I'm from Coleman, Alabama. And if you go to the Coleman Cooperative Utility Board, it's a town meeting to be able to have a discussion about raising any of the utility rates. And are you going to get in front of my family members and people in Coleman, Alabama, and tell them, hey, the Russians are probably going to impact something, and I need to raise your utility bill by 20 cents so we can do cybersecurity of operations equipment and IT networks? And it's just going to be deer in the headlights. It's not going to happen. So I think the mechanism for resourcing these entities is not clear. And that's somewhere that the federal government, as well as public utility commissions and state and local level leadership, could do a lot to try to clear those lanes. There's a lot of funding out there that the government puts out that a lot of members don't even know how to get. And so there's that. And then the last answer, quite candidly, is I know IronNet's done the same, but we've done the same to just try to be good community members, where there's certain co-ops and smaller players that either we massively discount or sometimes we just give it to them for free. I'm happy to run a good business and charge fair value. But when it comes to our smallest community members, I think there's an unspoken pledge in our community of, hey, we'll all take care of each other, but you got to take care of the small ones too. And I think most good vendors in this space understand that.
Yeah, and I agree with Rob, what Rob just said. So if you think about New York, there's 47 munis and 4 co-ops there. And they don't have the resources across the board to defend themselves in the manner that New York Power Authority or Con Ed or Avangrid would have. However, if you take all that information and you take the people that are interested in protecting the New York grid and the Northeast grid, you now have companies that have assets that can look at that data and assist. So this is where working together really pays off. The munis and co-ops, interestingly, are going to see a lot more trash traffic that would be of interest because they're more vulnerable. If we can put the net over them as well and help protect them using our resources, Dragos and IronNet, and working with the bigger energy companies who are interested in protecting them, what we get is a better system for all of us. You know, when you think about the major companies, as Rob said, that bring our grid together, they have the resources, they're working hard, they're doing a great job to keep the grid up. The grid gets the power down to the munis and co-ops. So that's where it gets to my old town in upstate New York. You know, as Rob said, the old Niagara Power used to say, okay, here's how we're going to get power to you. Here's what we're doing. It's the last mile to the house. Those are ones now that are at jeopardy. So the energy sector and the CEOs and CISOs and that have pushed us to do just this. They felt that this was relevant. I really would just emphasize how good they've been in pushing to take care of the small munis and co-ops and bring them in. So I think that's part of the future. If we do that with them, you can see how it extends into the education sector, the health services sector, and others. So I think this is a part of the future. We just got to get on and do it and evolve the way we do cybersecurity.
Absolutely. And let's touch a little bit more. This question comes up all the time around, hey, sharing information. So, and the comfort sake around that. So there's a question here that's around, hey, if the sharing is anonymous, wouldn't that create another tentacle for disinformation? And so wouldn't it make sense to have an approved, verified user community with identified, contributors in there? So how do you guys address that question in terms of the anonymous aspect of the sharing information, but really focusing on enrichment and correlation of that information?
So I can answer for our side, and obviously John Alexander for IronNet, but they are a little bit different. It's the same theory, same focus. It's why we can partner. But the nature of IT and OT are different enough that the technical solutions have to be different as well. And so there may be some slight differences here. On our side of it, it's not anonymous in such the sense that anybody can opt in. Like it's not anybody can walk on the street and share information. And it also addresses some of the questions that we're getting asked in the Q&A around like, hey, can we open this up to have like ISACs and others involved? And I'll address that in this kind of statement as well. But you have to have the technology. And that's it seems like it's a vendor answer. Like, oh, I want you to buy the Dragos platform to be able to opt into Keeper. Like it sounds like I'm slinging something. But the reality is you have to have a sensor and you have to understand your collection and what analysis it does. Like I can't just have multiple sensors from multiple different products, open source or competitors, because I won't know what comes through that sensor or how they do the analysis. So on the back end, I've got to trust that my collection stack is the same to be able to do the type of analysis that you want to be able to do. So everybody that's in Neighborhood Keeper, as an example, has the Dragos platform. They each then sign up. They fill in some basic level details like I'm a small, medium, or large company. I'm in the electric industry. I'm in the water industry. I'm in the US. I'm in Australia. Like high level metadata stuff that's not identifiable. And then there's no actual data that they're sharing because you can't on the operations side in the US related to like NERC regulations and so forth for good reasons. So it's just the insights. So I could say, hey, participant 2 and utility 5, you had both seen the exact same behaviors of an attack taking place that we saw somewhere else. Do you guys know about this? And so we can even reach out and communicate to them and say, hey, whoever you are, participant 2 and 5, here's what you need to know. And every other participant now sees all of that, the communications, the interaction, the alerts, everything all in the same threat picture. So we're all able to take our own actions, regardless of if we've seen it manifested in our networks yet. So there is a one-to-one relationship. That participant 2 is Salt River Project as an example, but we don't know that association. And if they ever leak it out, if it ever gets on Twitter or whatever else, they have an ability to shuffle their key and they go right back into having a different identity. So the think of it as like a pseudonym where they have like think of it like a digital hash that it is unique to that utility, but we don't know what that digital hash represents in terms of the utility's name. So it's a completely technologically irreversible identity. Like if the FBI comes to us with a search warrant and says who's utility two, we literally can't tell them. We have no ability to do that. And we can all be sharing the same insights. So that's how it works, which is why you can't really open it up to people that don't have sensors and so forth, because there's no stack of technology stack for them to operate on. However, some of the ISACs are involved, like electric ISAC and downstream natural gas ISAC and oil and gas ISAC are involved, so that they can write questions across the data sets. And so it allows that partnership to be there, but it's not like there's a data set to give to a researcher to look into. It's not data, it's insights, which I'm sure is slightly confusing, but it allows us to get the job done without compromising sensitive information or proprietary information.
Yeah, so ours is very much the same. We have a sensor in whether it's virtual or physical in all of our customer sites. Those sensors send data to the customer's backend for analysis in our case. And all the information that is shared into the Iron Dome, our collective thing, is anonymized. It is anonymized to protect, just as Rob said, all the things about those companies. And it allows people, and only those people that have the sensor or the ability to connect to that with a VPN and the right credentials, to see the data that's being shared. And we're doing the same thing with the government, giving them authority to look at the data and ask questions. They won't know which companies are asking questions, but they can say, is anyone seeing this black energy variant? And they can put that question out in a hash, and the whole system will be quickly assessed, and within minutes back with an answer. 4 companies have that. And then they can say, here's what you should do to go fix that. And only those companies will know, and nobody else will know who those companies are. They'll see that there's an issue. Other companies will be aware there's something going on with black energy. They'll just know they either have it or they don't have it. And that's the value of that public-private partnership. We think the anonymization, for just the reasons Rob said, is important. Protect them and allow them to share information at network speed for protecting our critical infrastructure. So I think that's a win-win for everybody.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Great. Now, we are coming up about 15 minutes left in the session. There's still some great questions on here. But General Alexander and Robert, are there other key points that you want to make sure you get across before we're down to the 2-minute wire here? So let me turn it back to you guys, and I'll see if a couple of the questions have popped up here.
Well, I think the main one that we tried to articulate, and I would just reemphasize, is that as the DHS bulletin that came out talking about heads up, if there's something going on, there's going to be a problem for us. That's a warning to everybody out there. And it's a warning that you could be either the victim, the targeted victim, or collateral damage. Either way, you lose. And so in that regard, it is important to all of us to now think about, so what are we going to do? This is not going to go away. The Ukrainian crisis will evolve to the Taiwan crisis, will evolve to a Middle East crisis, will come back to a Poland crisis, or somewhere else in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, or somewhere in the APJ area. And cyber will be the tool of choice by our adversaries, because it's easy to deploy. You don't have to rush troops around the world. You can reach out and hit us in the homeland. So think about that as a missile attack-like capability without having missiles. And right now, those missiles are invisible to our government and to our private sector. And so that's the real key. We've got to think about, all of you on here play a key role in helping to protect your company, our nations. And as you think about that, if nations want to work together, you've got to be able to share this at network speed. I believe those cyber engagements could get really bad really fast. And if things go wrong, we've already seen that China and Russia have agreed to work together in a military fashion. And that's the first time in 60 years that they've reached that type of agreement. That should be a stark warning to all of us to say, okay, they're very serious about their national ambitions, Eastern Ukraine and Taiwan. And with those, what are we going to do about it? What's the right thing to do? What does our country and our allies do in this case? And as soon as we take a position, we open up ourselves to these types of attacks. And I think that's what concerns me. We're not ready for them. We've got to get going. And this is where you, all of you out there, can help us go faster. The faster we get this up and show people what can be, the faster we'll get our country and our allies protected. Over to you, Rob.
Yeah, well stated. I think kind of to echo on that, we've seen a lot of infrastructure community members move very quickly because they've heard the call. But sometimes we're not all that good at sharing the success stories and putting our heads up above water and talking about it a bit more broadly. We're starting to see that happen a little bit, because one of the biggest changes that's happened, and I think it started with Ukraine 2015, is the policymakers and CEOs and boards are now more aware than ever of the difference between IT and OT. And a lot of times when you get a board meeting or a CEO presentation, they see the NIST cybersecurity framework and all these metrics and insights and so forth. A lot of times that's only been enterprise IT. And it's not been IT and OT and the unique differences between them, as well as the reasons to do them together. And I see a lot of those board conversations adapting to ask, well, hold on, is that the enterprise or is it enterprise IT? And so you're seeing a large shift in the discussion of these infrastructure companies, whether it's utilities, manufacturers, consumer packaged goods, whatever, fully understanding that they generate revenue on the OT side of the house. However, they still can't do it without the IT side of the house either. And so it's not that one's more critical than the other. It's that you really do have to do both. And we have neglected the IT interactions to OT, and we've neglected the OT networks for quite some time. And I see a bunch of questions in here, so I won't end with any sort of grand statement, but I'll capture just a couple of the questions that are coming on the technical use cases. And there's a bunch on like, hey, for smaller entities, or what can we do right now, even if we're a larger entity? Like the time's up, so what should we be doing? And I think there's lots of controls out there. Again, follow a standard, top to critical controls from CIS, whatever you want. But there's really like 5 things that if you could just go do it quickly, you'd be in a good place. Number one is have a defensible architecture. And these are for IT and OT, by the way. The implementation will be different, but the 5 things are the same. Have a defensible architecture. What that means to me is you have the ability to put humans into the environment to make it defended, because there is no defended product without a human in the loop. But they're defensible by having good segmentation, good network architecture, good environments, good log collection, things like that. What's in your environment is an element of defensible architecture. The next thing then is the monitoring, whether it's like an IronNet type solution on the IT side or a Dragos type solution on the OT side, doesn't matter. Those types of products, regardless of who you choose out there in the community, get in and get the visibility of the monitoring, real-time network monitoring to understand what's happening inside of your house. Assume you're already compromised, be able to root that out. The third one I would do is a key vulnerability management program. We spend way too much time in the community, in my opinion, focusing on vulnerability management. There are some vulnerabilities you should be patching right now. There are some vulnerabilities that probably introduces more risk to patch than to leave them alone, because they're not being exploited. Or they introduce no new capabilities, especially on the OT side. It's something like 7% of the vulnerabilities are things that you really need to address. The rest, why even bother your operations staff on? Like, I've responded to more power outages from well-intentioned IT people than the Russians, Iranians, and Chinese combined. So just be careful at the plant level. And then the next one for me is a instant response plan that you have with tabletop exercises rehearsed across your company. Do an IT one, do an OT one, do a blended one. Make sure your board and your executives are on that page and understand that. And then, of course, wrapped around all of this is the people in the process side of it and skill development. But that's going to also get a lot better with the ability to do collective defense and really have your peers across the community to be able to say, hey, I saw this. What did you think about that? How did you deal here? That's where information sharing can be useful. When you get to the emails and the conversations and the forums, that's good when you're operating on ground truth reality that you all saw in real time. So those are the things that I think if you were to do those things, you would have a really good program. I would then enforce multi-factor authentication on any and all remote sessions that you can. If you were to do those 5 things, you would have a world-class security program. And then, of course, everything after that's just whenever you have time and resources, go for it. But those are the things that I think would be critical.
Those are outstanding. And that was really also a number of questions here that addresses, especially Brian Walker's question around other capabilities that you infuse into building out a robust collective defense program. A couple kind of two-part question here too, just for providing some clarity as well. And, Annabelle Lee asked the question around, this discussion seems to focus on the electric sector and IT/OT. But what coordination is being done across all 16 critical infrastructures? So I think that is, I think the conversation we're having here is broader than just electric. It does cross those other infrastructures. And then the other question around collective defense, is it just North America and US, or are you looking at other countries, looking globally? And are there any concerns or issues there from a sharing of anonymized data? So two-part question there. I don't know if General, you want to take one of those, and then Robert can address next.
Oh, what I'll do is I'll take one and Robert can actually correct it as we go along. I think first on Annabelle's thing about the 16 sectors, and sometimes they say 18, depends on how we're counting the critical infrastructure. But you're right. We're talking about all of those. We're referencing the energy, the oil and gas, and I would hit the financial and potentially healthcare and government sectors as logical attack points for Russia if something were to go on. But we don't know what they're going to do, and we don't know where collateral damage will exist. So I think what DHS is doing with CISA is how do they look at all those sectors, bring that data together. So we're talking about all of that. We're talking about looking at that. We're focusing some of our comments here on the energy sector because that's what's been hit by Russia in the past. We've seen Iran hit that. That's probably a key attack point for them, but there will be others. They've also gone after the financial sector. The question of what will they do on the healthcare? What are they going to do on the education? What are they going to do on the states? Those are all also of concern. I believe that if we were to look at this just standing back, we need to prove that real-time picture with sectors, show that between the private and public sector so they can see how this works, and really run that as a real radar picture for cyber that helps protect across all of it. Then making it available to all 16 sectors and actually to all companies is going to be part of the future. I think that's where this is going to go. The cloud architecture is making this something that is much easier to do. We couldn't have done this 6 years ago with hardware, trying to put hardware, it wouldn't scale. Now it will scale. We can do this as a service. And I think that's part of the future. So that is the reality for the future. We've got to push towards it. Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll touch on the cloud thing for a second too, because I saw a bunch of the Q&A in there, especially in the operations side of the house. Anytime we hear cloud and similar, everybody freaks out. And the question is, wouldn't it be better to completely segment IT and OT networks? And I want to address that head on. And in a perfect world, if you could actually achieve an air gap, you're actually completely physically separated, not a firewall, but truly separated your IT and OT networks, that actually is a really good defense. And so a lot of people in the community, when we talk about air gaps, we always laugh, we roll our eyes. Like if you bring it up at a conference, at an ICS security conference, people will groan because we're all tired of hearing about air gaps. But air gaps aren't bad because they're a bad control. If you go to a nuclear power generation site in the United States, they're truly air gapped and it's a damn good control. They're bad because they're not possible in most places outside of a nuclear power generation station. And the IT/OT convergence discussion isn't one about the technologies converge. Hell, we've had Windows and substations for a long time. Okay, both, I guess, the operating system and the physical manifestation. But we've had Windows operating system in substations for a long, long time. The convergence is one where we're starting to connect up systems and data sharing between operations and IT, and the interconnectivity there makes both critical. Colonial Pipeline, based on the public reporting, when they went down, according to the testimony that Joe put out there, was really two reasons. One, the billing server got hit, but the billing server is not just a billing server in a gas pipeline. The billing server is also the tasking server. Where is the product going to go? When is it going to get there? So all the insights to what operations was doing is in an IT system. And they went down because they didn't have visibility across their operations environments. They couldn't assess that the adversary was there or not. And so they shut down for safety and the benefit of the public. So when you think about our infrastructure today, there are hyper connectivity coming to IT and OT. So forget cloud or not cloud, the connections are there. Then when we can take advantage of cloud, that's fantastic. NERC did something that I was shocked by, which was amazing. And during this whole 100-day sprint activity that was taking place in the electric utilities, NERC issued a practice guide. The regulator from the North American electric system said, yeah, you can absolutely take advantage of architectures like this that take advantage of cloud resources if you meet these certain qualifications, if you're not sharing data, if it's actually anonymous, like all the things that we've talked about. And that was amazing to see. And so we're able to unlock a lot of those capabilities we haven't historically. Now, to address your specific question on kind of the sharing piece of it, we need to take care of our house. We need to take care of our community. Then we need to keep spreading it out from there, as John Alexander was talking about. And there's no reason to go to the manufacturing community to talk insights across the electric community if neither of them are already doing that in their community. But as they do that, then we do get really unique insights. What's happening in the electric sector differently than in the natural gas sector. There's a lot of interconnections between those two. So what's the common picture look like, and what's the differences, and where should we focus? I think about the intrusions into the Indian energy system that's taken place over the past couple of years. The technical indicators of what is happening in India are probably irrelevant to any utility in the United States. But the behaviors, the how they're doing it, the tactics and techniques they're doing, every one of us should be looking at that, aware of it, and implementing defenses around it. Because whether or not we come across the same adversary, it's the same playbook. So my point in saying that is, as we get out of our communities and into other communities, and then even get into global, there's an amazing opportunity to shine a light on adversaries anywhere in the world they operate, and make sure all of us in real time have the insights of exactly how they're doing it. Not only so you know what to do, but you can prioritize what you're doing. Because that's the issue most of us run into. We know all the security things we'd love to do, but in what priority order against ground truth reality of what the threats are actually doing? That's what this can also bring people.
Yeah, if I could add one thing on this. We're focused on the nation state attacks here in our discussion, but I just like to point out that hackers and hacker teams are evil, and you just think about all the different hacker groups that are doing ransomware and attacks like that, or that are using the network to get money. Think about North Korea. When we look at that, you can see this isn't just nation states out there. You're getting criminals that are using the network to have nation state like acts. Colonial Pipeline. We can probably tie pieces of that back to a nation state, but the reality is those are hackers that are out there trying to make money off of us, steal our intellectual property or steal money. So as we look at it, it's not, if we could get all the countries to work together, we still have this big problem with criminals out there.
Absolutely. And so we've got just a few minutes left for a couple closing remarks from both of you. In the spirit, though, of talking about the broader problem, we do have a number of financial services attendees on. So if there's a quick headline from both of you on, David's question around situation triggers that are particular to the financial services sector, what should they pay attention to? Is there anything that comes to mind for you that they can take away from here?
Yeah, I'll just quickly start by saying it's the same kind of logic. Again, the implementation of the technical controls will be different. If I was a financial services institute, I would have already installed IronNet at this point. So like you have fun and go on that direction. We're probably not a good fit because there's not a whole lot of OT that you're going to protect right now. Building automation systems and things like that maybe later. But realistically, this is where in the Solarium Commission, and I think Tom Fanning was really big on supporting this as well, is this topic of significantly critical infrastructure. So we all know that everything's critical, right? But there's the SICI list as well, the significantly critical infrastructure list. And that's your telecoms, your banks, your financial services, and your electric companies. And I'm not trying to make anybody feel that they're not special. Everybody's special. Coleman County Cooperative Electric Company is not on a critical infrastructure list, but if it goes down, it really impacts my family. It's pretty critical to our life. But when you're talking about national security, the SICI list would be the ones that sort of raise above. And if I was in the financial services organizations, I'd be making sure that my telecoms and my electric companies are getting the resources and the awareness they need. And I'd be banding together, not necessarily on the technical information sharing, but on the, well, how did you pitch this to the board? How did you talk about this to your regulators? How did you engage the government? Those conversations are where it gets critical, because if any of those three go down, all of them are impacted. And by the way, if your water company goes down, you can't generate electricity. So it's all interwoven. And as a community, we all need to take the risk the same level of seriousness because it impacts all of us. How you deal with it and so forth may be different from there.
Awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you. So go ahead, General.
I would just add to that. Yeah, just when you think about it, we have some Section 9 banks and other big banks that are really good at protecting themselves. There are somewhere between 5,000 and 5,500 banks out there. They would be better protected if they could see what's hitting the financial sector as a whole versus what's just hitting their bank. So collective defense goes beyond the individual bank to say, you know, pick a top tier bank. They're going to have a great security section. Look at all the small banks, all the mid-sized banks and all those out there that they deal with. The collective defense approach puts all that together and gives you a more complete picture that is actionable now with the federal government on the public-private sharing part of that. So back to you, Michael.
Incredible. We are at the top of the hour. 30 seconds for any closing remarks, Robert or General Alexander.
Just want to say thank you. And again, for everybody that's in the infrastructure community, these are tense times. So thank you for keeping the lights on, the gas flowing, manufactured goods there. Like I sincerely appreciate that, as my family does.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Rob said. You're on the front lines now of the future war for our country, because cyber will be the first engagement. And what you do matters for the protection of our country and other countries. We have to work together to ensure that security. So thank you for taking the time today.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Great engagement as well, and look forward to our next step in the series. So look for that coming shortly. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.